We ask ourselves, when racialized perceptions have been placed on you and people who look like you for hundreds of years, what happens when there is a pandemic? In the words of an Asian woman, the pandemic is more than what meets the eye. It is more than the deadly death rates, strict quarantine regulations, and vaccine rollouts. In cities with a big Asian population, like New York and Los Angeles, we carry an innate terror of sudden hate crimes or verbal attacks while walking down these busy streets. In far flung areas, there is very little freedom of showing our culture, of being threatened with otherness if we do not assimilate to these foreign lands. Thus, we can never find a sense of belonging outside our ethnic enclaves. Down in the American South, there is a heightened fear of violence and crimes faced by Asian American business owners even before the pandemic happened. This violence ranges from robbery to the safety of personnel. In Susie Wang's interview with an Asian American business owner from the South, it was reported that there was a sense of violence after their Korean delivery man got killed during his delivery rounds. While this incident is attributed to the dangerous community he went in, however, police reports say that it was a hate crime. Hate crimes are not new to our community, yet there is a silent strength to rise above the stereotypes, battling the feeling of otherness and debunking the model minority myth. According to Harvard's publication, Asian Americans in Law, the model minority myth is often applied to Asian Americans, who as a group are often praised for apparent successes across academic, economic, and cultural domains. Successes typically offered in contrast to the perceived achievements of other racial groups. As a person who identifies herself as a triple minority, an Asian, an immigrant, and a woman, I recognize how the community suffers from hatred stemming from pre existing prejudice from hundreds of years ago. Recalling the Asian diaspora in 1892, the community endured a painstaking racialization of diseases, a far outcry from the actual cause. From the 18th century Asiatic cholera, the verbal name calling and taunting gave birth to 21st century racial slurs such as Kung Flu virus and Chinese virus. According to Grace Kim and Tanvi Shah, epidemics as a tool to target and discriminate against the model minority group is not new to the society. One of the earliest records in American history happened in San Francisco during the 1876 smallpox epidemic when Jewish immigrants were accused as disease carriers. Now, in the 21st century, we are still in the same place. After it was confirmed that the virus started in the wet market of Wuhan, China, Asian safety become compromised wherever they are in the world. In a report by Audra Birch, physical attacks were the most reported case of media harassment against people of Asian descent. The same source says that there had been 110 episodes where there was clear evidence of race-based hate as of March 2020. She also believes that hate as a motive for committing crimes can be historically hard to prove. However, this was counteracted by the statistics in New York City and Boston where the overall crime rate fell while hate crimes against the said minority spiked. To take these numbers into account, metrics by the New York Times in this slide prove that hate crimes against Asians are undercounted over the decades. Thus, having low crime charges can significantly lead to the dismissal of the racial hostility and prejudice they experience. This leads me to my main question for this talk. Collectively, how can we achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion for Asian Americans while holding ourselves accountable for perpetuating stereotypes? In an attempt to answer this and to shed light on the local experiences of Asian American business owners in the Richmond area, I interviewed Vanahem, a Cambodian American business owner of the food stall Royal Pig. He described the pandemic as a blessing in disguise, an awakening where he became more aware of the state of racial discrimination in the community. He admitted that before the pandemic, he would just laugh off these racial slurs. But now he understands that racial slurs are not simply a joke, but are offensive statements. Ham also feels strongly the government is not doing its job to make the community feel safe and supported. His argument is that, once again, they've only turned us on each other and marginalized us. While government and intercommunity support are beneficial for the most part, Americans should hold themselves accountable for providing accessible resources and for making Asians a part of the bigger community. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina destroyed homes and livelihoods of Vietnamese Americans in the Gulf South, which threatened them to be displaced in a community where they have thrived since the 1970s. Professor Frank Shaw stated that catastrophe that Katrina left did not merely wash homes away, but also erase their cultural and economic contributions for over 30 years. According to the respondents in his study, the rebuilding process after the hurricane left them marginalized. But the accessibility of Vietnamese religious and economic spaces is a big step toward acknowledging their transnational identities. Thus, we have to make sure that the Asian community can reaffirm their cultural identities and feelings of belonging despite marginalization. While the community resilience is often applauded, it is time to lessen their burden by supporting them by any means necessary, from giving information towards loans that small businesses can avail of or translating documents for those who need help. Like the situation of Gulf South, these economic and religious spaces did show up for the Asian community. They made sure to include them into the overall culture of the town they inhabited. Thus, with this mutualism, they help in preventing further marginalization of the Asian community. This marginalization also proved that the bigger community can provide support in helping these communities in recovery. Thus, one takeaway from this situation is that the American society in general has to show up for the Asian community. We have to make spaces where marginalization cannot foster and where the community's pleas of support are taken seriously. It is more important than ever that we see the problem with discrimination and hate crimes as a national problem rather than those of a marginalized Asian community. It is also important to debunk the stereotypical myths that we have about the Asian community. One of these is the minor feelings, a product of the racial discrimination prevalent in American society. Minor feelings are defined by Hong as feelings that arise, for instance, upon hearing a slight, knowing it's racial, and being told, "Oh, that's all in your head." For example, racial slur should not be interpreted as provocative because the problem is not who stated the slur, but with the sensitivity of the community. That is a very harmful thought for the community as their feelings were contained in a space where their pleas are not heard at all, where there are no place for them to thrive. Thus, with the spike of hate crimes and discrimination, the Asian community is forced to keep their pleas of help and support, for there is very little solution nor action to the situation at hand. Growing up in a culture that revolves around complacency, the community's struggle were diminished. As described by Hong, their emotions do not conform to the archetypal narrative that highlights survival and self-determination. We should not diminish them to an extent where they are made to fit in spaces rather than acknowledging the inflicted racial trauma. If we battle these stereotypes, we can lessen the certainty of their conformity to their stereotypical profile. With Hong's interview in The Guardian, she elaborates more on the stereotypes. Asian Americans are often stereotyped as successful, model minority immigrants. At the same time, they are also often excluded from discussions of U.S. culture. In her words, she mentioned how Asian American women are seen as fetish objects, while Asian American men are often considered unmasculine, untrustworthy, suspicious, and foreign. Also, Chinese is seen look for Asians the way Kleenex is for tissues. It is time to have a bird eye view of racial discrimination and society's ignorance, and to embrace their collective experiences as a whole. While the model minority myth and stereotypical profiles have affected them in finding how to respond with the pandemic, we should not take their silence for nothing. The American society should do better in adhering to the needs of the community, especially with strong policing in cities where hate crimes against Asian Americans are higher than ever, for example, in New York City. When we acknowledge what is currently happening in the Asian Americans community pertaining to violence, we can open up inclusive, safe spaces for these communities to seek for help and to voice out what should be done to limit these instances. It is time to have these conversations with the Asian American community so that we can foster equity and coexist in a national way. The impact of racialization is not erased by a pandemic. Our lived experiences during the pandemic all vary as each individual in a community has their circumstances. Now is the time to acknowledge inequalities placed in a society hundreds of years ago and how it conditions us to impart stereotypes. Now it is time to hold ourselves accountable and invest in our interconnectedness to advocate for the safety and well being of the Asian community.